Hello, my name is Marilyn Halperin. I'm the Director of Education at Chicago Shakespeare. It's my pleasure to be here today at the Newberry Library with Dr. Daniel Greene, who came back to the Newberry 2 years ago to take on the mantle of President and Librarian here and as Adjunct Professor of History at Northwestern University. Before that time, he served as Exhibition Curator and Historian at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., where he curated Americans and the Holocaust, an exhibition examining the major cultural forces of isolationism, xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism, and how those forces influenced Americans' responses to Nazism in the 1930s and 40s. We're so grateful to have this opportunity to share your knowledge, Dr. Greene, with our audiences and yours. So welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be a part of an interview with Chicago Shakespeare.
I'd like to start out with an initial question that really is asking you what Americans knew about Nazi Germany during the 1930s and 40s, and how did we even get our information at that time?
It's a good place to start to set up because Jan Karski is really such an anomaly, as we'll see in this play, bringing information as an individual. That wasn't the norm for Americans in the 1930s and 40s. But one of the myths out there about this history, I think, is that Americans didn't know anything about the Nazi persecution and murder of the Jews as it was occurring. And that's just not right. There actually was a lot of information available to Americans in newspapers, in radio reports, in newsreels that people would go watch before they'd watch the feature film in the 1930s and 40s, and in magazines of the day. So some of the magazines that lasted well into the 20th century or beyond, like Time and Newsweek, other magazines that maybe young people won't have heard of anymore, like Collier's or the American Mercury, were writing stories about Nazism. Certainly, if you take an event like Hitler's rise to power, that was big national news, right? A democracy has collapsed in Germany. There's a new world leader. Of course, it shouldn't surprise anyone to know that that would be covered all over the American press. But the fact also that anti-Semitism was essential to Nazi ideology was right there from the beginning. The American press didn't miss that. So if you were paying attention to the news in 1933, in 1935, in 1942, you could know that this new regime had risen, that they were persecuting Jews in a different way than they had been persecuted before. And then even by 1942 or 1943, if you were paying close attention, you could see that murder was happening. One of the challenges is it was never the top story. The top story in the United States in the 1930s is the Great Depression, and the top story in the 1940s is the war. And so it doesn't often rise. There are moments of exception, but it doesn't always rise to the top of Americans' consciousness.
Can we talk about Jan Karski, the subject of this haunting story, who he was and how this man coming up through the Polish resistance ended up at the White House in a meeting with President Roosevelt in 1943.
Yeah, it's an astounding story. He's part of the Polish resistance, obviously deeply anti-Nazi, and really committed as much as anyone in this history to combating Nazism, to getting the word out. Look, Karski's not Jewish. He cares deeply for Jewish victims. He cares deeply about the Polish people. When the Nazis invade Poland in September of 1939, his country is destroyed. So that I think that shapes him deeply, and he is committed to getting this information out to the world. And he does so in such an astounding way. He takes extraordinary risks, risks his own life multiple times because he is so committed to getting this information out. He becomes part of this network that sneaks him into the Warsaw Ghetto as the Warsaw Ghetto is operating, and then also to a transit camp where Jewish victims are being deported to their deaths in killing centers. One of the technicalities of this that Karski himself actually didn't understand, but historians understand, is actually where he was. He thought he was in the Belzhytz killing center, and he was actually in a transit camp that was outside the Belzhytz killing center. The point is not to criticize Karski for that, but to show how chaotic this was, and how risky this was for him to be part of an underground, to pose as a guard to make it into the Warsaw Ghetto and to see what was happening in this transit center, which is really part of the heart of mass murder by that point, was figuring out how to move Jews to these killing centers, and he's a firsthand witness. So then he makes connections to be able to make it to London, to talk to the Polish government exile in London, and then to come to the United States in the summer of 1943. So I always think about how astounding it is that this man, who is 28 or 29 years old at the time, is in the Warsaw Ghetto in the fall of 1942, and he's in the White House in the summer of 1943 talking to President Roosevelt about it. Wow. Yeah, it's astounding.
Is there anything you feel that we learn from President Roosevelt's behavior in that meeting with Karski?
Yeah, absolutely. So Roosevelt's the most, or arguably one of the most powerful people in the world. Karski's a 29-year-old member of the Polish underground. There are only 3 people in the room. It's Roosevelt, Karski, and the Polish ambassador to the United States, and they're in a study. They're not in the Oval Office. They're in a smaller office in the White House. And so Roosevelt dominates the meeting, as Roosevelt dominated and controlled all meetings. One of the characteristics of President Roosevelt that scholars will talk about is, if you and I went to a meeting with Roosevelt and we disagreed about what he should do, and we each argued passionately against each other, we would leave the room thinking we both had won. That was part of his political skill in the way that he controlled meetings. So by most accounts, Roosevelt did most of the talking during the meeting. He asked Karski about the Polish military, about the Polish people. Karski really wanted to tell him what was going on, what he had witnessed in terms of the persecution and deportation and murder of Europe's Jews. So they finally come to that by the end of the meeting. But the point I'm making is that they talked about what Roosevelt wanted to talk about for the most part. But Karski then gets in at the end of the meeting. This is really going off his oral history that he gave later in his life, where he desperately asks Roosevelt, "What can I tell the Polish people?" And this is remember this, Roosevelt says, "Tell them we shall win the war." And I think that's such a revealing answer, because it speaks to how the US government thought about what it meant to fight against Nazism. What I mean by that is the Nazis, you can think about the Nazis fighting 2 wars. The Nazis were fighting a war against the Allied nations, and they were fighting a war to destroy the Jewish people of Europe. And in response, the Allies and the United States decide to fight one war. They fight a war to defeat Nazism, to defeat fascism. They don't fight a war to rescue Jewish people. The logic in the Roosevelt administration is the killing stops when you stop the killers. And so to rescue the victims, they see as a diversion of resources. It's a logic that's tough to struggle with. It makes a lot of people today morally outraged. I understand that, but Roosevelt was consistent in this logic that killing stops when you stop the killers. So you defeat the Nazis to divert resources, which is really what Karski was asking. What can I tell the Polish people? Tell them we'll win the war. Roosevelt's saying that these atrocities will stop when the Nazis are stopped. And it's hard to struggle with that 75 years on, but it's a locked down logic of the Roosevelt administration. And that Karski meeting, I think, is such a key point where Roosevelt expresses that to an individual, but it's how the administration acted all the way along.
And it's a history we don't learn.
It's not a history we learn as much because we don't tend to put the history of World War II and the history of the Holocaust together enough. We might tell a story of World War II around the Greatest Generation, and we should honor Americans' accomplishments during World War II, right? 16 million Americans serve in World War II. 400,000 Americans die in World War II. These are great sacrifices. But when we start to put the war and the Holocaust together, you can realize, for example, take D-Day, for example, right? June 6th, 1944, which is a year after Karski meets with Roosevelt. US forces are first landing in Western Europe. That's very far from where the mass murder is happening in occupied Poland, where Karski had come from. And by that point, 5 million Jews are dead already, before our troops even land on the ground in Europe. So when you start to talk about the war and the Holocaust together, I think you can see Americans' response in a different way. But Karski is one of those moments too. Karski's meeting with Roosevelt is one of those moments where we wish, looking back, that the US government might have been more focused on rescuing the victims in addition to defeating the perpetrators. So I think one other really critical moment, and this is portrayed in Remember This as well, is Karski meets with Felix Frankfurter, the US Supreme Court Justice, who's Jewish. I believe that meeting is also just 3 people. It's Frankfurter, the Polish ambassador, and Karski. And so Karski tells Felix Frankfurter what he's seen in the Warsaw Ghetto and what he's seen in this transit camp, which is just horrific, as an eyewitness to the Holocaust. And Frankfurter says, young man, because remember Karski's in his 20s, Frankfurter says, he either says, young man, I'm unable to believe you, or young man, I can't believe you. So let's say he says, young man, I'm unable to believe you. And the Polish ambassador, as everyone recounts this meeting, breaks in and says, Felix, he's not telling you any lies. He's telling you the truth. He's seen this firsthand. And Frankfurter, in the kind of logic of a Supreme Court justice, said, I didn't say he was lying. I said I'm unable to believe him. And I think that also speaks to a gap for Americans at the time. We now know, 75 years later, we've seen visual evidence of the Holocaust. Think of all of the cultural productions about the Holocaust, all the oral histories we've seen with survivors. We now recognize this as a distinct historical event, and we have the benefit of hindsight as we look back to understand. Americans had been hearing rumors about this in 1943. They didn't yet have much visual evidence like we do now, although they had a lot of newspaper reporting and radio reports about it. But it's beyond belief for some people. It's truly beyond belief. And it's beyond belief for Frankfurter, for Justice Frankfurter, even when he's confronted by someone who's been there on the ground and has seen it. Now, I don't say that as a way to apologize for American inaction, but just to struggle with the unprecedented nature of the crime. And maybe the unprecedented nature of a crime from a government that everyone thought came from the most advanced or one of the most advanced countries in Europe. So many Americans, even at the highest level, just truly couldn't allow themselves to believe that the extent of the crime was true as it was happening, even though they were talking to someone who had seen it. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One reason was that this generation had lived through World War I just about 25 years earlier, and there turned out to be a lot of atrocity stories circulated in World War I that were not true, So they were skeptical of what they would call at the time war rumors. Now, it turns out, as we know, that what Karski saw was not at all a war rumor, but some Americans are prone to disbelief because of that. And then I think it's just, there's something about human nature that you might not want to believe that something like this could happen, so you don't let yourself believe.
Yeah. The enormity of
Right.
it.
Exactly.
In the play, Karski talks about what he witnessed in occupied Poland, as you're saying, and he says at one point, "This is not part of humanity."
Yeah.
This is a larger, more philosophical question, but from your perspective, should we understand the history of the Holocaust as part of humanity?
I think we have to, unfortunately, to recognize that this is central to humanity. I think if we do something like, say, the Holocaust is about, we used to say, man's inhumanity to man, right, or humans' inhumanity to other humans, we're letting ourselves off the hook from struggling with the fact that actually, throughout human history, we see war and atrocity and murder of groups considered other, that the Holocaust is certainly an extreme example, but it's not outside of history. And if we think about it as outside of history, rather than struggle to understand it, we're really struggle to understand it within the realm of human history, we're doing a disservice, I think, to ourselves, and I would argue to the victims too. We need to struggle with thinking about this within the course of human history. But I think Karski, in that moment in the play and in his life, I mean, there are moments in the oral history, which I think was taken in the late 1970s with Claude Lanzmann for the film Shoah, where he gets up and walks off camera because he's so agitated, might not be the right word, upset, struggling, and that's part of human history too, right? Even Karski, having seen this, maybe wants to believe that he never would have had to see something like this.
And we want so badly to define humanity and being human in a way that paints us as a species that could not do these horrible things.
Right, right. And then Karski witnesses it, and then once you've witnessed it, how could you unsee it, right? To use the language of today. I think that's one of the brilliant things about David Strathairn in this play is he's not very still physically, right? I mean, he is he's kind of constantly on the move, and even in taped interviews I've seen with Karski, he's moving, and he it's almost like he wants to get out of his body that saw these things. It's so disturbing to have witnessed this mass murder up so close, and I hear that in his writings, and you see it in taped interviews with him, and then you see it in Remember This with the portrayal of Karski. So I think wanting to say it's outside of humanity might even be, I mean, I'm not a psychologist at all, but wanting it to be outside of his own experience and wishing that it hadn't been part of his experience.
Karski downplays his own influence, and you mentioned this earlier and Remember This, and at one point he says, "I was forgotten and I wanted to be forgotten." You have devoted much of your research to studying the Holocaust and memory, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about the essential nature of remembering.
Yeah, we're at such an interesting moment. 75 years plus since the end of World War II, right? So you don't have anymore very many survivors or veterans with much living memory. There are some, right? And so as someone who's been studying this topic for 20, 25 years, I've had this incredible privilege to know many survivors and many veterans. And so first, I feel an obligation to tell their stories, right, to their memory. I never met Jan Karski, but I know people who were students at Georgetown who took classes from him also, and I think that they would probably say that we have an obligation to remember his heroism. He's a hero, right? He risks his own life. He's willing, as we learn in the play, he attempts to take his own life at one point rather than give his captors the information that they want, right? So those sort of incredible risks, I think we have an obligation to remember them. And of course, as we get further and further away from a historical event, and we don't have those living eyewitnesses anymore, we remember an event in a different way. So I feel like we're actually living at this really interesting hinge moment in relation to World War II, where we will soon be without any living witnesses. And I just think about the privilege of knowing them, but then the obligation of continuing to tell their stories in multiple formats. And Remember This does that, I think, in a beautiful way. I wonder how many people who come to the theater will have ever heard of Jan Karski, but they'll leave and they won't be able to forget him, I think.
In these times that we find ourselves living in now, and looking back at Jan Karski's life, how can we understand the path that this man chose to take, where, as you've said, risking his life, and then, as now, it would be so much easier, so much safer to remain a bystander than what he did. How can we understand that?
So I wish I had a good answer for this. This is something that I really struggle with. Why do people take risks like Karski did? I don't think you can frame it as a what's in it for him question. I don't think he would have thought that way. Of course, I'm not in his head. I shouldn't presume to be, but that's not what it's about. I think it's some deep sense of duty, maybe obligation, that for some reason most people don't feel, but a small number of people do, right? Why would an American in the 1930s or 40s take in a refugee child from Nazi Germany? Why would someone take someone in today from Afghanistan, right? It's easier, of course it's easier not to, right? So what motivates the people who do, say, rescue Jews or risk their own lives to get information out to the Allies? Some of the people who perform these kind of heroic deeds may feel a religious obligation to do it, right? And there are examples of that in this history. But I don't think that's Karski either. I think for him, it's a human obligation. I think he's seeing the worst of humanity, and he is trying to reflect back the best of it, and is but even that sounds easy to say, considering that at any moment in the Warsaw Ghetto he could have been discovered, or in the transit camp he could have been discovered, and he would have been killed on the spot. So I don't know the answer to the question of why does someone take extraordinary risks like this, but it's a question that I often think about when I confront this history. I never have figured out a satisfactory answer. And I think often, so sometimes people like Karski were asked this question too, and very often they'll give some kind of answer around the idea of, well, it was the right thing to do. And, well, of course it was the right thing to do, but most people don't do it, right? So why does someone like Karski take these risks? I don't know, but I think that's what makes his story so endlessly fascinating.
And when we all would wish our better self would aspire to.
That's
which
right.
is why we keep asking that question too.
That's right. That's right. I think when people confront the history of the Holocaust, there's two questions that rise to the surface. One is, how did this happen? And there are a lot of ways to learn in detail how this happened and to answer that through the work of historians and artists and others. But then there's the question, what would I have done? And that takes a lot of honesty with yourself to think about what would I have done. But I mean, who would have done what Karski did?
So remember, this is framed with big questions about human behavior. And before he gets into the character of Jan Karski, David Strathairn directly addresses his audience, asking us such questions as, and this goes back to our conversation, what can we do? Mm-hmm. Do we have a duty to do something? How do we know what to believe? And what does it mean to know? As a historian who studies Americans' responses to Nazism, how do you confront these questions?
I like that. I found myself so drawn in by that direct address, right, before David Strathairn kind of goes into the character, right? I love it. I mean, maybe for Chicago Shakespeare, it's great to have a prologue and a direct address too, right, to the audience to tear down that illusion of the fourth wall, right, and to say this should matter to you, and it does matter to you today. So and I think those questions he's asking are critically important questions, and not just for Holocaust history. When we see an injustice, what is our duty? What is our obligation? I think if we're honest about human nature, it's easier not to act, right? So, and not to say that everyone needs to act in the heroic way that Karski does, but there's a lot in between heroic acts and risking one's life and passivity, right, or indifference. And so what I love about those questions at the beginning of the play is I think it's trying to say to the audience, move beyond indifference when you see injustice. And that's, I think, that was Karski's message. It was Karski's message to President Roosevelt. It was Karski's message to all the Allied governments that he was able to speak with, and he lived it in his experiences during the Holocaust, and I think as a teacher as well. And then at the end of the play, he's got this haunting line, great crimes start with little things. And I think about that a lot in confronting the history of the Holocaust, because how do you know, right? You can't live your life as if every little thing is going to lead to mass atrocity, right? I mean, that way lies madness, right? But you do have to stand up so that little things can't turn into great crimes. I think that great crimes start with little things is a haunting way that the play ends and comes back to that kind of direct address to the audience as well, that hopefully they should be changed in some way by encountering Karski's story, and hopefully for the better. I think one of the most compelling Holocaust historians is a colleague at Northwestern, Peter Hayes, and he has in confronting Holocaust history says, beware the beginnings, which kind of sounds Shakespearean, right? Beware the beginnings. And when I think about that, it's, well, how do you know when the beginnings are? Right? Sometimes you don't know until you look back, and that great crimes start with little things is I think an echo of that kind of beware the beginnings. And so we have to know how to react without overreacting. But also without standing passively by when we see injustice. And I think I think those questions are really trying to help the audience get to that place, to thinking about that. We talked earlier about how Americans knew what they knew, right? And that Karski comes in 1943 and meets with President Roosevelt, and meets with other American leaders, meets with world leaders in London as well. But his information also gets out to the American people in the popular press. Karski writes an article for Collier's magazine in October of 1944. And he writes a detailed article about what he had seen in the Warsaw Ghetto and in this transit camp. So this was not only, his information was not only making it to the President of the United States, it was making it to American readers. He publishes an article in a magazine called the American Mercury as well. I think the title of that article is Inside the Warsaw Ghetto. This is as the Holocaust is still happening. And it's in American magazines. And his voice is harrowing, and he closes, I just want to tell you how he closes that article because it speaks to the play too. Some of the details of this are brutal. I mean, I've studied this for years, and every time I read this article, there's part of me that says, I can't believe that this was in an American magazine in 1944. But he closes with this question about belief. He's in the transit camp, and he's writing about Jews who are being transported to a killing center being overpacked into the rail cars that transported them to the killing centers. And he says the two cars were now, this is from Collier's in 1944, the two cars were now crammed to bursting with tightly packed human flesh. All this while, the entire camp reverberated with a tremendous volume of sound in which groans and screams mingled with shots, curses, and bellowed commands. Nor was this all. And then he says, I know that many people will not believe me, but I saw it, and it is not exaggerated. I have no other proof, no photographs. All I can say is that I saw it, and it is the truth. Even today, when I remember those scenes, I become nauseated. So he's sick, he's physically sick at seeing this, but he's also concerned about belief. Just as Justice Frankfurter was unable to believe him, Karski knows that people are going to be unable to believe him, and there's such a desperation in his mission to tell people this is true and to get the word out there, and I think that's part of his heroism.
Yeah. Daniel, thank you. Thank you for taking this time. Thank you for your expertise and knowledge that you brought to this, to our audiences, to Newberry's audiences. Remember, this is such an important story. We're so proud to be bringing it to our stage. I hope that many people will come and see it, and it will be running November 3rd to the 14th. And this conversation only makes me want to see it more. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks.